Imagine for a second that you are a historian and you've just made a discovery that completely, totally upends Western literature.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, right. Like imagine discovering that the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis, and the very last chapter, Revelation, were actually written hundreds of years after the rest of the text.
Right. By completely different authors?
Exactly. By completely different people with entirely different political agendas.
Hmm.
And imagine that the core of the text in between those bookends wasn't this like static artifact. It was a living, breathing, open source document that thousands of people had just been editing and adding to for millennia.
I mean, you'd completely rethink what that text was, wouldn't you?
You have to. It wouldn't just be a book anymore. It would essentially be a mirror of human evolution.
Yeah, it would fundamentally shatter that glass case we usually put history into. Because, well, we have this deep-seated psychological need for our foundational texts to be static.
Right. We want the original copy.
Exactly. We want to point to a stone tablet or a perfectly preserved manuscript and say, there it is. That is the definitive record of who we used to be. But the reality of ancient storytelling, especially when we look at the DNA of the Asian subcontinent, is that these texts are not museum pieces.
Right, they're not dead.
No, not at all. They are actively replicating, mutating, and adapting to survive the changing eras.
Which brings us to the exact mission of our deep dive today. So, welcome to a custom-tailored exploration just for you. Today, we are stepping far, far away from the nostalgic television adaptations or, the purely faith-based Sunday school versions of this story you might be familiar with.
We really are.
We are taking a magnifying glass to one of the most influential narrative structures in human history, the Ramayana. But we are looking at it through a fiercely rigorous academic lens.
Precisely. We are approaching this monumental epic through, well, the disciplines of literary criticism, human psychology, Indology, and textual forensics.
Sounds intense.
It is. But we want to be clear from the outset, right? Looking at this text academically doesn't diminish its profound spiritual significance for millions of people.
No, of course not.
In fact, I'd argue that understanding the mechanics of how this story was built and preserved over thousands of years, it only deepens its majesty.
Because the scope of what we're dealing with here is genuinely staggering. We're not talking about a short poem. We're going to explore a text comprising roughly 24,000 verses divided into 7 massive books.
A story that has lived in the active human consciousness for over 3,000 years.
Yeah, 3,000 years. So our roadmap for you today is pretty dense, but it's fascinating. We're going to decode the true dating of the text. We'll unravel the mystery of the poet who supposedly invented a new mathematical form of language out of pure grief.
That's a great story.
It's incredible. And we'll walk you through a 50-year, real-world academic excavation that literally rewrote the book's history.
And beyond all that history, we are going to dive into the minds of its characters. Because if you were sitting there wondering why the academic history of a 3,000-year-old epic matters to you today, well, it's because understanding the Ramayana is essentially a masterclass in understanding yourself.
Totally.
The intense psychological and ethical dilemmas these characters navigate, the agonizing choices between duty and love, between institutional power and personal righteousness, or deep knowledge and blinding arrogance, they are the exact same tensions we navigate in our modern lives.
Absolutely. So let's start at the absolute foundation. If this text is a massive 1,000-year philosophical snowball, I feel like the most obvious question is, who packed the very first snowball and when?
Right. The chronological puzzle.
Yeah, because before we can analyze the ethics of the story, we have to understand the physical world it was born into. So let's tackle the timeline. When was this epic actually written? Because I know dating ancient texts is just an absolute battlefield for historians.
Oh, it is arguably the single most fiercely debated question in the entire field of Indology. And to really grasp the complexity of this battlefield, you have to understand that historians and theologians aren't even using the same calendar.
Wait, really? What do you mean?
Well, there are 3 completely distinct perspectives on the dating of the text, and they use radically different frameworks for understanding the nature of time itself.
Okay, because if you're listening from a modern secular perspective, your first instinct is probably to look for, like, carbon dating or a copyright page. But ancient India didn't operate that way, so walk us through the first perspective.
Right. So the first is the traditional faith-based view, which operates on the Hindu cosmological concept of cyclical time. In this view, time isn't a straight line moving from the past into the future.
It's a circle.
Yes, it's a massive repeating circle divided into four vast epochs called yugas. You have the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga.
And the Kali Yuga is the era we are currently living in, right?
Exactly. According to traditional belief, the events of the Ramayana actually occurred during the Treta Yuga.
Okay, and if we try to, translate that cyclical cosmological time into our modern linear calendar years, what kind of number are we looking at?
It's an astronomical figure.
Yeah.
The Kali Yuga alone is said to last 432,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah. The Dvapara Yuga is double that, and the Treta Yuga is triple. So if you do the math, placing the epic in the Treta Yuga means traditionalists believe these events happened roughly 869,000 years ago.
869,000 years. That's a breathtaking scale of time. It treats the text almost as a geological reality rather than a human invention.
Yes. In this perspective, the sage who wrote it was a contemporary of the events, writing a literal historical record of a divine incarnation on Earth.
But obviously, when we step into the halls of modern academia, secular researchers are looking for a different kind of timeline, right? Something based on physical and linguistic evidence?
Exactly. And that brings us to the second perspective, Western Indology, which began systematically in the late 19th century. In 1893, a German scholar named Hermann Jacobi attempted to date the text using astronomical descriptions found within the verses.
And what did he come up with?
He proposed a window somewhere between 3000 and 2500 BCE. But as scholarship evolved through the 20th century, modern titans of the field people like A. McDonnell, John Brockington, and Robert Goldman, they shifted the timeline significantly forward.
Okay, to when?
Their consensus argues that the core text was developed much later, somewhere between 500 and 300 BCE.
Right. And then the third perspective comes from the Indian research tradition itself, right? Scholars like Dr. P.V. Kane.
Yes, Dr. Kane, who wrote an absolute masterpiece on the history of ancient Indian civil law, and F.E. Pargeter. They tend to place the core text a bit earlier than the Western consensus. They usually argue for an origin between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE.
So you have this massive spread, 869,000 years ago, 3000 BCE, and 500 BCE.
It's a wide net.
Which raises the obvious question for anyone listening.
Wait.
How on earth do scholars actually gather evidence to argue for these dates? If we don't have a dated title page from the author, how do you lock down a timeline?
You basically have to become a literary forensic scientist. Scholars rely heavily on three main pillars of evidence: linguistic, astronomical, and archaeological. Let's start with the linguistic evidence because it's incredibly concrete.
Right.
If you look at the Sanskrit used in the Ramayana and compare it to the Sanskrit used in India's other massive ancient epic, the Mahabharata, you notice something immediately.
What's that?
The language in the Ramayana is much more polished, refined, and strictly rule-bound.
I've always found this fascinating because language is like a fossil record. Because around 400 BCE, there was an ancient Indian grammarian named Panini.
Yes, exactly.
And Panini basically did for the Sanskrit language what Isaac Newton did for physics. He formalized it. He wrote down the absolute definitive rules of grammar, syntax, and structure.
Precisely. And the fact that the Sanskrit of the Ramayana adheres so beautifully and closely to Panini's strict grammatical rules is a massive clue. It strongly suggests to scholars that its written form, its final, polished, standardized version, must have come after Panini codified those rules.
So post-400 BCE.
Right. However, there is a crucial caveat here. Just because the final written polish happened around that time, it does not mean the story itself was invented then.
Ah, right. The oral tradition.
Exactly. The songs and the chanted verses passed down from generation to generation, they could be and likely are much, much older.
Which makes total sense. You formalize the grammar when you finally write it down, but the song existed long before the sheet music.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so linguistics points us to the written compilation around maybe 400 to 300 BCE. Let's talk about the astronomical evidence. You mentioned Hermann Jacobi trying to use the stars to date the text back in the late 19th century. Have we refined that methodology?
We have brought immense technological power to it. This is where the research gets incredibly modern. Researchers like Dr. P.V. Vartak looked at the text and noted that it is absolutely packed with highly specific astronomical data.
Like specific constellations.
More than that, it doesn't just say it was a starry night. It details the specific alignments of planets, the exact lunar mansions, and the position of constellations during major events, like the birth of the hero, Rama.
Okay, so it's really detailed.
Extremely. Dr. Vartak took these ancient, highly specific descriptions and inputted them into modern planetarium software. This is the exact same software modern astronomers use to model the night sky. Because the movement of celestial bodies is essentially a giant, predictable clock, the software can roll back time and show you exactly what the sky looked like from a specific latitude and longitude on Earth on any given date thousands of years ago.
And what happened when he ran the simulation?
By plugging in the specific planetary alignments described in the text for Rama's birth, the software searched back through thousands of years of sky maps and pinpointed a singular, specific date where all those planets aligned exactly as described.
Wait, it found a real date.
Yes, January 10th, 5114 BCE.
Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting, but also where I have to heavily push back on this methodology. Because if you are listening to this and thinking critically, this sounds a little too perfect.
Fair enough.
Let me offer an analogy to explain why this makes me skeptical. Imagine it's 3,000 years in the future. Human civilization has lost most of its records, and a historian is trying to figure out exactly what year William Shakespeare wrote the play King Lear.
Okay, I see where you're going.
So they take the descriptions of the massive apocalyptic storm on the Heath in King Lear. They plug those descriptive weather patterns into some futuristic meteorological database, and the computer spits out. A storm of this exact barometric pressure and wind speed hit London on October 14, 1599. Therefore, that is the exact historical date King Lear occurred.
It's a fantastic analogy you're asking. How much of the Ramayana's astronomy is literal scientific observation by an ancient astronomer, and how much is just poetic license?
Exactly. Isn't it far more likely that a poet trying to convey the immense divine importance of their hero just said, and when he was born, all the most powerful planets were in their absolute highest, most auspicious positions?
Right, using the stars for dramatic effect.
Yeah. They are using the stars as a literary metaphor to say, this guy is important, not acting as a human telescope recording historical coordinates.
That is the exact pushback that mainstream Indology provides, and it's a completely valid critique. Poets manipulate imagery for dramatic and theological effect. However, the researchers who defend the astronomical method push back against that skepticism with pure statistics.
How so?
They argue that the text doesn't just list one or two planets being in a good position. It lists highly complex multiplanetary conjunctions that are mathematically incredibly rare.
Oh, I see.
The statistical probability of a poet just guessing a specific alignment of 5 planets, the sun and the moon in specific lunar mansions, an alignment that actually did occur in the sky over India thousands of years ago, is millions to 1. They argue it's statistically impossible for it to be mere poetic coincidence. It had to be a preserved observation.
Which is a fair counterargument.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating tug-of-war between literary analysis and statistical probability. But let's look at the third pillar, the dirt. What does the physical archaeology tell us?
Well, when archaeologists take their trowels to the ancient city of Ayodhya, which is the capital city of the epic's hero, they do find physical layers of human settlement, and those layers date back to roughly 1000 BCE.
So the city was definitely real.
Exactly. So we know the geographical center of the story was an active human settlement in the ancient past. However, when archaeologists look for the other side of the epic places like the antagonist Ravana's grand golden palace in Lanka, the archaeological record goes cold.
Nothing.
We have not found a definitive ancient structural layer in Sri Lanka that perfectly matches the opulent, massive city described in the text.
So when you synthesize all of this, the rigorous linguistic rules of Panini, the highly debated statistical astronomy, and the physical dirt of Ayodhya, what is the actual academic consensus that you would be taught in a university today?
The prevailing consensus among leading scholars and institutions, like the Sahitya Akademi, is that the Ramayana must be viewed as a layered text. It absolutely did not spring into existence over a single weekend by a single author. They argue that the core seed of the story, the oral tradition, the songs originated around 1000 to 700 BCE, which lines up with the archaeological settlement of Ayodhya. Then it was formalized, polished, and written down into its core epic poetry form between 500 and 300 BCE, lining up with the linguistic rules.
And the final layer.
Finally, massive, significant additions and philosophies were layered onto it between 200 BCE and 200 CE.
You know, instead of using the cliche of a snowball rolling down a hill, I think a much better way to visualize this for you listening is to think of it like an ancient cathedral.
Ooh, I like that.
Let's say a genius architect poured the original stone foundation and built the central nave around 700 BCE. It's beautiful, it's functional, but then 300 years later, a new generation comes along. They don't tear the church down, they respect it too much.
Right, but their tastes have changed.
Exactly. So they build a massive Gothic spire on top of it. And 200 years after that, another generation adds intricate stained glass windows to reflect their new theological debates. It is one building, but it contains the architectural DNA of 5 different centuries.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Recognizing that the text is layered like a cathedral doesn't diminish its power. In fact, it proves how incredibly vital and important the text was. Successive generations kept adding their finest architectural additions to it because the Ramayana was the primary vehicle through which the civilization discussed its deepest values.
Okay, so we have a solid grasp on when the foundation of this cathedral was poured, but knowing the timeline naturally leads us to the architect who poured that first foundation. Because the traditional origin story of this epic doesn't view this as a bureaucratic committee project. It points to a single moment of visceral human trauma.
Yes, the story of its creation is almost as famous and perhaps as culturally significant as the epic itself. We are talking about the sage Valmiki, who holds a unique title in Indian literature. He is revered as the Adi Kavi, which translates to the first poet.
I absolutely love this story because it roots the origin of epic literature, not in divine dictation, but in raw, painful human empathy.
It really does.
Let's paint the picture.
Yeah.
According to the tradition, Valmiki is at the banks of the Tamasa River. He's just going about his morning, preparing to bathe, and he sees a pair of birds, specifically Saras cranes. They are in the middle of a beautiful mating dance. It's a moment of pure harmony, pure life.
Right.
And suddenly an arrow strikes the male bird. A hunter hidden in the brush has shot it. The male bird falls to the ground dead, and the female bird circles it, crying out in absolute heart-wrenching agony.
And Valmiki witnesses this. He feels the grief of the female bird so deeply, so overwhelmingly, that he spontaneously curses the hunter. Now, we are speaking in English today, so we won't recite the original Sanskrit, but the meaning of the curse is essentially, "O hunter, may you find no rest for the rest of your years, for you have killed one of these birds while it was blinded by passion."
But the magic of this moment isn't just the moral outrage. It is the mechanics of how the words came out of his mouth.
Exactly. Valmiki is instantly shocked by his own voice because out of his profound, chaotic grief, the Sanskrit word for this raw grief is shoka, his words naturally organize themselves into a perfect mathematical rhythm.
It's so cool.
It is. The curse he uttered naturally formed a 32-syllable meter. Specifically, it was 4 lines with exactly 8 syllables per line.
Shoka, which is grief, transformed into shloka, which is verse. The emotional chaos crystallized into mathematical order.
It is a stunning linguistic connection. This 32-syllable structure is called the Anushtub meter.
But let's clarify something for the listener, because this is a crucial point. Why does inventing this 32-syllable rhythm make him the Adikavi, the first poet? Obviously, human beings were singing songs, rhyming words, and reciting prayers long before Valmiki stood by that river. Poetry, as a broad concept, existed.
It's an essential distinction to make. He is the Adikavi not because no one had ever strung pretty words together before. He is the first poet because he was the first to take a profoundly human event, driven by secular, raw human emotion, and mold it into a complete, structured Mahakavya, a great, continuous epic. Furthermore, we have to understand why this specific 32-syllable meter was a technological revolution for ancient storytelling.
Break that down. Why is the math of the syllables a technology?
Because in an era before mass printing, before widespread writing, stories survived exclusively through oral transmission. You had to memorize thousands of lines. If you were just memorizing free-form sentences, it is incredibly easy to forget a word, add a word, or entirely lose the narrative thread.
Right, like playing a massive game of telephone.
Exactly. But the Anushtub meter provided a highly structured memory palace. Because the rhythm demands exactly 8 syllables per line, if a reciter forgets a word or drops a syllable, the mathematical rhythm instantly breaks.
The singer feels it immediately.
Yes, their ear immediately tells them, wait, the beat is wrong, I made a mistake. It allowed massive, incredibly complex philosophical epics to be memorized and transmitted across centuries with astonishing fidelity. This meter became the defining architectural unit of classical Sanskrit literature. The Bhagavad Gita, written much later, is primarily composed in the exact same mathematical rhythm that Valmiki invented on the banks of the Tamasa River.
So he literally invented the operating system for ancient Indian literature. But let's dig into Valmiki the man, or the legend of the man, because if you look at the folklore surrounding his past, it is wild. Is there an academic consensus on whether Valmiki was a real historical guy who walked the earth?
Much like the dating of the text, there are two distinct camps. One camp firmly believes Valmiki was a genuine historical individual. They argue he likely took a popular pre-existing local ballad about an ancient king named Rama, and using his new poetic meter, elevated it into a sweeping literary masterpiece.
And the other camp?
The other camp suggests that Valmiki might not be a single biological person. Instead, they propose it was the name of an entire tradition, a specific school of bards and singers who collectively composed and refined the epic over several generations, attributing it to a mythical founder.
But the traditional folklore about his personal backstory is so incredibly specific, and it carries such a heavy philosophical payload. I'm talking about the story of Ratnakar.
Yes, the traditional backstory is that long before he was a revered sage, Valmiki was a violent highway robber, a dacoit named Ratnakar.
From Robert, the first poet.
Right. He lived in the forest, and he would ambush, rob, and sometimes kill travelers to steal their wealth, which he used to support his family. According to the legend, one day, he attempts to rob the celestial traveling sage, Narada. Narada doesn't fight back. Instead, he stops Ratnakar and asks him a simple, piercing psychological question.
What does he ask?
He says, "You are committing these terrible acts of violence to feed your family. But when the time comes to face the cosmic consequences of your actions, will your family share in the karmic burden of your sins?"
It's a brilliant disruption of the robber's rationalization. Ratnakar goes home, assuming his family will stand by him. He asks them, and to his absolute shock, they say no.
Brutal.
Yeah, they tell him, it is your duty as the head of the household to feed us. How you acquire the food is your problem. The sins and the karma are yours alone.
It is a devastating wake-up call. Ratnakar realizes he is destroying his own soul for people who will not share his burden. He runs back to the sage, Narada, completely broken, seeking a path to redemption.
And Narada gives him a mantra.
Right. He tells Ratnakar to sit down, meditate, and continuously chant the name of Rama. But Ratnakar is so deeply entrenched in violence and psychological darkness that his mouth literally cannot form the holy name Rama. So Narada gives him a linguistic trick.
Oh, this is fascinating.
He tells Ratnakar to chant the word for death or dead, Mara. Ratnakar sits on the forest floor and begins to chant, Mara, 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 Mara. And as he repeats it faster and faster, the syllables bleed into each other and the chant naturally transforms into Rama, Rama, Rama.
The legend says he sits there in deep meditation for so many years that the forest reclaims him. Anthills, which are called Valmika in the ancient language, actually grow over his entirely still body. When he finally achieves enlightenment and emerges from the dirt, he is reborn. He leaves the identity of Ratnakar behind and is named Valmiki, the one born from the anthill.
From a purely historical standpoint, we can view that as myth, but from a philosophical standpoint, why does the tradition attach this highly specific, violent backstory to the author of their most revered epic?
Why do they?
Because the story of Ratnakar becoming Valmiki is the core philosophical thesis statement of the entire civilization. It argues that radical, fundamental human transformation is possible. It insists that a human being's ultimate worth and identity are not permanently defined by their birth, their societal class, or even their darkest past mistakes.
Wow.
Identity is defined by current actions and the capacity for redemption. It says that even a murderer can transform into the ultimate poet of the divine if they are willing to do the internal work.
It's a beautiful thesis on human potential. And as someone who geeks out over literature, here's where the text gets absolutely mind-blowing for me. Valmiki doesn't just write this epic story and stay behind the curtain. He actually writes himself into the narrative as a physical character.
He does indeed.
In the final book of the epic, after the hero Rama's wife, Sita, is tragically banished to the forest, where does she go for safety? She goes to Valmiki's ashram. The author of the book gives shelter to the heroine of the book. She gives birth to Rama's twin sons in his ashram. And who teaches those twin boys to sing the epic poem of the Ramayana? Valmiki does. He teaches his own poem to the sons of the hero, who then travel back to the capital city and sing the hero's own life story directly to him.
It is an astonishingly complex narrative loop.
It is entirely postmodern. We think of meta-narrative, where an author breaks the fourth wall and interacts with their own creation as this clever 20th century literary invention. But here is an ancient epic doing it seamlessly thousands of years ago. It shows an incredible level of literary sophistication, blurring the line between the creator, the creation, and the audience.
It is a brilliant literary device. But, and this is a massive but that is going to pivot our entire conversation, how do we actually know Valmiki wrote that part?
You're thinking about the cathedral, the architectural additions.
Exactly, because you just mentioned the final book where Valmiki appears as a character, and modern rigorous textual analysis has completely upended our understanding of what the original architect actually built versus what later generations added to the cathedral.
Okay, let's set this up clearly for the listener.
Yeah.
Because this is the crux of modern scholarship. If you walk into a bookstore today, right now, and you buy a beautifully bound copy of the Valmiki Ramayana, what are you actually holding in your hands? Are you reading the exact unaltered words that Valmiki spontaneously mathematically composed on the riverbank 3,000 years ago?
For a very long time, scholars honestly didn't know for sure, because there wasn't just one master copy of the Ramayana locked in a climate-controlled vault somewhere. Over thousands of years, this massive text was copied entirely by hand. Scribes painstakingly etched it onto fragile palm leaves and birch bark. And as the story spread across the massive, diverse geography of the Indian subcontinent, it splintered. Thousands of different physical manuscripts existed in different regions, and when scholars finally started looking at them, they realized they didn't all match.
They mutated. A scribe makes a mistake or adds a local legend, and then the next 100 scribes copy that mistake. These are called textual variants.
Precisely. So how do you solve a problem of that magnitude? How do you find the real original text buried underneath thousands of years of copies, additions, and regional adaptations?
You undertake what has to be one of the most exhausting, monumental academic projects in the history of global literature. Let's talk about the Baroda Critical Edition.
In 1947, right around the time India was achieving its independence from British rule, the Oriental Institute in the city of Vadodara, often referred to as Baroda, embarked on a 50-year textual excavation. It is simply mind-boggling in its scope.
50 years. Just sit with that for a second. That is not a research grant. That is an entire human career. Generations of scholars handing the baton to the next generation, dedicating their lives to untangling a single poem.
They sent researchers to scour the country, digging through temple archives, royal libraries, and private collections. They eventually located and collated over 2,000 different ancient manuscripts of the Ramayana.
Over 2,000.
Yeah, and you have to understand the physical reality of this. They weren't looking at neat PDFs. They were dealing with crumbling, decaying palm leaves that smelled of dust and aged oil. They were dealing with manuscripts written in entirely different regional scripts, some in Grantha, some in Malayalam, some in Sharada or Devanagari.
And for the vast majority of this 50-year project, they didn't have computers to scan and compare the texts.
No, it was done by human eyes. Teams of scholars had to sit in rooms and compare these fragile manuscripts line by line, verse by verse, syllable by syllable. They had to track every single variation.
Oh, wow. That sounds excruciating.
It was. If manuscript A had a verse that manuscript B was missing, they had to trace the lineage of the manuscripts to figure out if the verse was an original piece that manuscript B accidentally dropped, or if it was a later addition that a scribe invented and slipped into manuscript A.
It's literary forensics on an unimaginable scale.
Well,
Trying to figure out if a scribe 1,000 years ago accidentally copied a note from the margin into the main text. So after half a century of this agonizing work, when they finally cleared away the brush, what did they discover?
the first major discovery was that the text had organically split geographically into two massive families, or recensions. You had the northern recension, drawing from ancient manuscripts found in places like Kashmir and Nepal, and you had the southern recension, which pulled from manuscripts in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Andhra.
And were they very different?
Yes, the differences between the North and the South were not just typos, they were massively significant. Entire multi-chapter episodes and theological debates existed in the Northern manuscripts that the Southern scribes had apparently never heard of, and vice versa.
Okay, but what was the bombshell? What was the finding that completely changed how we read the book today?
The most shocking conclusion, and something that fundamentally alters the philosophical architecture of the epic, regards the first book and the last book. After 50 years of cross-referencing, the scholars at Baroda concluded with a very high degree of certainty that the first book, the book detailing the hero's youth, and the seventh book, the final book detailing his later life as a king and the banishment of his wife, were not written by the original poet.
Wait, really? The beginning and the end?
Yes. They are interpolations. They are the Gothic spire and the stained glass windows added to the cathedral centuries later by completely different authors.
Wow. Okay. I know we set up the cathedral metaphor, but to definitively say that the actual beginning of the story and the actual ending of the story are later additions, how can they be so sure? How do you look at a 3,000-year-old poem and confidently declare, yes, chapter 1, chapter 7 were ghost written by a different generation?
It comes down to internal evidence. When the scholars analyzed the middle sections of the epic books 2 through 6, they found a remarkably consistent master voice. The vocabulary, the specific grammatical quirks, the way metaphors were constructed. It all pointed to a single, unified architectural vision. But when they analyzed the first and last books, everything changed. The Sanskrit felt different. The vocabulary shifted.
Like reading a novel where a new author suddenly takes over and starts using completely different adjectives.
Exactly. But it wasn't just the grammar. There were glaring narrative contradictions. Things are stated as absolute historical facts in the middle books that the characters in the first book seem completely unaware of.
Well, that makes sense.
But the most damning evidence was the conceptual tension, the psychology of the characters, the way the hero behaves, and the rigid, almost dogmatic philosophical arguments he makes in the final book violently contradict the nuanced, empathetic personality established in the core text.
So if they surgically remove the later additions out of the traditional 24,000 verses, how much of the original foundation was left standing?
The critical edition essentially distilled it down to roughly 18,000 accepted core verses. This core basically comprises the events from the moment the hero is banished from the city to the moment he wins the Great War and returns. That middle section is considered the closest thing we will ever have to the original, unmodified vision of the first poet.
You know, it is very easy for someone listening to this to feel a bit cynical, to hear this and think, oh, so the parts of the story I thought I knew are fake. But I want to offer another analogy because I think feeling cheated is the wrong reaction. Don't think of the Ramayana like a modern novel where someone snuck into the printing press and forged the final chapter to trick you. Think of the Ramayana like an ancient, magnificent, open-source Wikipedia page.
I love that framing. It captures the communal ownership of the text.
Right. It wasn't a dead artifact sitting on a dusty shelf. It was the most important cultural document the civilization had. When society evolved over centuries, when new, complex philosophical and political debates arose that the original author couldn't have foreseen, successive generations didn't discard the epic. They added to it. They edited the Wikipedia page to reflect their shifting worldview.
They absolutely did.
They added to the story because they desperately needed their greatest hero to speak to their contemporary modern issues.
Exactly. And realizing that the first and last books are later editions doesn't destroy the text. It makes it infinitely more valuable to historians. We literally get to watch a civilization think out loud, arguing with its own past over a span of 1,000 years.
Okay, so we've stripped away the layers. We understand what was added and what is the core foundation. Let's actually walk you, the listener, through the narrative architecture of this cathedral, the plot itself. Because the structure is highly deliberate and philosophical. We mentioned earlier that the epic is divided into 7 massive books, which are called kandas.
Yes, and the etymology of the word khanda is quite beautiful. It literally translates to the segment of a bamboo stalk. It's a profound metaphor. It implies that each section of the story is a complete self-contained node, but they all must connect end to end to form a single, strong, flexible entity.
Let's do a deep dive structural overview of this bamboo stalk. We start with the first book, the Balakacha.
The Balakach is the invocation and the origin. Narratively, it covers the miraculous birth of the hero, Rama, his youth, his early mystical training with a powerful sage, and his marriage to the heroine, Sita, after he successfully strings a massive divine bow that no other king could lift.
But structurally.
Structurally and philosophically, the most significant thing happening in this book is theology. This is the book where Rama is explicitly and overtly established as a divine incarnation, an avatar of the supreme preserver god, Vishnu, who has descended to earth to destroy evil.
Which, Tying directly back to our previous point, we now know this entire book was a later interpolation. So the original core text likely viewed Rama much more as an extraordinary, struggling human hero trying to do his best, rather than an omniscient god pretending to be human. The theology of his divinity was an architectural spire added later.
Precisely. The civilization's view of him evolved from ideal man to incarnate God, and they added the first book to explicitly state that theology. Now, the second segment of the bamboo is the Ayodhya Kot, the Book of the City.
And what's the thing here?
If I had to summarize the theme of this book, it is the ethics of duty. Rama is the beloved prince, about to be crowned king, but due to a complex political promise his father made years ago to Rama's stepmother, Kaikeyi, Rama's coronation is canceled. Instead, he is banished from the city to live in the wilderness for 14 years.
This book is intensely gripping. It is essentially a masterclass in ancient political philosophy and succession crises. It reads almost like a prestige television drama like an ancient version of Succession or Game of Thrones, but without the cynicism.
That's a great comparison.
It's entirely about court intrigue, the agonizing clash between legal duty and personal desire, and the terrifying burden of keeping a promise, even when that promise destroys your life.
It is deeply, rigidly grounded in the real world of civilized politics, palace walls, and human failing. But then, the narrative crosses a boundary. We move to the third segment, the Aranya Kanch, the Book of the Forest. And the genre and tone shift entirely.
How so?
Rama, his wife Sita, and his loyal brother Lakshmana leave the civilized city and enter the vast, unknown wilderness. In anthropological terms, the forest here acts as a liminal space. It is an unstructured, wild, unpredictable zone completely outside the laws, protections, and rigid social structures of the city.
It's the ultimate psychological testing ground, because it's easy to be a perfectly moral prince when you're sitting in a palace surrounded by guards and advisors. But the rules of the city don't apply in the jungle.
Exactly. In this liminal space, the neat political problems of the previous book vanish. Here, they encounter supernatural threats, terrifying demons, powerful ascetics, and eventually the ultimate inciting incident of the entire epic occurs. The violent abduction of Sita by the brilliant and terrifying demon king, Ravana.
Which shatters the hero's world and propels us into the fourth and fifth segments, the Kishkinda Kanta and the Sundara Kanta. These are the books of alliance, justice, and devotion. Rama, desperate and wandering, forms a political and military alliance with a kingdom of intelligent, powerful monkey warriors to search the earth for Sita. And this is where one of the most famous figures in global mythology enters the story, Hanuman.
Yes. The fifth book, the Sundara Kanta, is arguably the most beloved and recited book in the entire epic. The word Sundara translates to beautiful, and it focuses almost exclusively on Hanuman's impossible solo mission.
Oh, this is the leap, right?
Yes, he leaps across the vast ocean to the island fortress of Lanka, locates Sita, held in captivity, proves he is an emissary of Rama, and gives her the hope she needs to survive. It is the absolute climax of Hanuman's physical power, intellect, and profound spiritual devotion.
And once he returns with her location, we reach the climax. The Yukake, the Book of War.
It is the longest and most strategically detailed book. This is the triumph of cosmic order. It is an exhaustive, brutal account of military strategy, troop movements, diplomacy, shifting alliances, and the massive supernatural battle where Rama finally slays Ravana.
And the rescue.
Right. The core epic ends with Rama rescuing Sita, returning triumphantly to his city of Ayodhya, and finally being crowned king.
Which, if this were a Hollywood blockbuster, is exactly where the soaring music would play and the credits would roll. It is the perfect, cathartic, happy ending. But there was the seventh segment of the bamboo, the later edition. The Uttara...
The final and undoubtedly the most painful and controversial segment of the text. It is the tragedy of idealism. In this book, Rama is finally ruling as the perfect king. His society is prosperous, but a dark undercurrent begins.
The rumors.
Yes. His citizens begin to maliciously gossip about Sita's purity, whispering that because she lived as a captive in another man's house for nearly a year, she must be tainted. To maintain the absolute unquestionable purity of the royal institution and prevent societal collapse, Rama makes an agonizing, deeply controversial choice. He banishes his own wife, who is now pregnant with his twin sons, back into the harsh wilderness.
It is a devastating, almost suffocating ending. And I want to point out the brilliance of this narrative architecture. Notice how dramatically the genre shifts to test the characters. We start with a grounded political succession thriller in a civilized city. Then it morphs into a supernatural survival story in a wild, liminal forest. And finally, it turns into a tragic, philosophical meditation on the unbearable, dehumanizing weight of institutional leadership. The changing environment constantly forces the characters to adapt or break their rigid moral codes, which serves as the perfect transition into our next major analytical lens, because the structure, the bamboo stalk, the cathedral, is intellectually fascinating. But an architectural structure is nothing without its inhabitants. This epic hasn't endured for 3 millennia because of its plot mechanics. It endures because of its deeply flawed, complex characters. We need to shift into pure psychological analysis. Yeah, let's treat these ancient figures not as simple heroes and villains, but as complex psychological archetypes. Let's start by putting the main character on the psychoanalyst's couch, Rama, the archetype of the burden of the ideal. How does a modern psychologist look at a man who is constantly described as perfect?
If we examine Rama through the framework of the renowned developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, the analysis is incredibly illuminating. Erikson proposed that a key stage of human psychological development is the crisis of identity versus role confusion.
What does that mean, practically?
Essentially, it is the painful process of figuring out who your authentic self is versus what society and your parents expect you to be. What makes Rama so utterly fascinating and ultimately so tragic is that he appears to experience absolutely zero role confusion. He perfectly, flawlessly, without hesitation, fulfills his assigned role identity. He's the mathematically ideal son, the ideal brother, the ideal king.
He's a man who always, in every single scenario, chooses public duty and institutional law over his own personal desires.
Yeah.
Every single time.
Yes. He suppresses his own ego entirely for the sake of the system. But psychology tells us there is a massive, crushing cost to that level of suppression.
That is the tragic limitation of his character, isn't it? He is so committed to being the ideal structural pillar of society that he often ceases to feel human. He becomes a prisoner of the very rules he upholds. When he banishes a pregnant Sita in the final book, he isn't acting as a husband who deeply loves his wife.
No, not at all.
He is acting as a political institution, protecting the throne from public doubt. He sacrifices his own humanity, his own happiness, and his wife's safety to maintain the structural integrity of the society. It is heartbreaking because he knows he is destroying his own life to do what the rules say is right.
It is the ultimate sacrifice of the self to the system. Which brings us to the counterweight of the epic, Sita, the archetype of dignified agency.
Now, I feel like there is a very common, almost casual pop culture reading of Sita that views her purely as passive, the ultimate submissive wife, the damsel in distress waiting in a garden for a strong man to rescue her.
And modern scholarship violently and rightfully pushes back against that superficial reading. Feminist scholars, particularly brilliant literary minds like Navanita Dev Sen and Madhu Kishwar, have done extensive, groundbreaking work exploring the immense agency hidden in plain sight within Sita's character.
Break that down for us.
Yeah.
Where is her agency in a story where she is literally kidnapped?
Her agency is in her relentless active choices. She isn't traded away in a political marriage. She actively chose Rama in a public trial of strength. When Rami is banished and tells her it is her duty to stay in the safety and comfort of the palace, she vehemently refuses to obey him.
Right, she insists on going to the forest.
Yes. She argues complex theology and moral duty with him until he finally relents and allows her to face the horrors of the forest by his side. During her captivity in Lanka, she is completely isolated, surrounded by terrifying threats, and subjected to immense psychological torture. And yet, she repeatedly verbally decimates Ravana. She withstands his threats and temptations with sheer, unyielding intellectual dignity. She refuses to break.
And the ultimate, most profound act of her agency happens at the very end of the story.
Yes. At the end of the final book, years after her banishment, Rama asks her to return to the city. But he demands that she publicly prove her purity to the citizens again before he can legally accept her as queen. And here, Sita makes a definitive choice. She refuses.
She just says no.
She decides she has had enough of the endless trials. She calls upon the earth, her mother, as she was mythologically born from a furrow in the ground, to take her back. The earth literally splits open, she steps into it, and descends. She actively chooses the void of the earth over returning to a society and a husband that continually demand she prove her intrinsic worth to satisfy public opinion. It is a powerful, definitive, and devastating rejection of the patriarchal demands placed upon her.
Wow. That reframes her character entirely. She doesn't lose the game, she realizes the game is rigged, so she flips the board and removes herself from it entirely. Now let's look at the antagonist, because I'm endlessly fascinated by Ravana. He's not some mindless, drooling cartoon monster who does evil just for the fun of it.
Far from it. Ravana is one of the most intellectually complex antagonists in world literature. He is a brilliant scholar who has mastered the vast philosophical texts of the Vedas. He is born a Brahmin, the highest intellectual class. He is an extraordinary musician, a patron of the arts, and an intensely disciplined devotee of the god Shiva. He possesses immense cosmic power earned through grueling meditation.
So what went wrong? How does a brilliant scholar-artist become the ultimate demonic tyrant?
If we apply the concepts of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, Ravana perfectly embodies the archetype of the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the unconscious aspect of the personality which the conscious ego refuses to identify in itself. Often the dark, repressed desires, the selfishness, the greed. Ravana's shadow is his unchecked, cancerous ego. He represents the terrifying part of human psychology that possesses profound, vast knowledge, but completely lacks wisdom or humility. He knows the ultimate truths of the universe, but he is destroyed by his own absolute arrogance and his delusion that his power makes him exempt from the moral laws that bind everyone else. It's the classic tragedy of the unchecked intellect, divorced from empathy.
I love that analysis. And the psychological richness extends perfectly to the supporting cast. Let's look at Hanuman.
Hanuman is the ultimate psychological paradox. In Eastern traditions, he represents the absolute pinnacle of spiritual devotion. But from a character standpoint, what's fascinating is the duality of his nature. He possesses near infinite physical and mystical power. He can literally expand his body to the size of a mountain. He can fly. He is practically invincible.
But his personality is the opposite.
Right. His defining psychological characteristic is total, unconditional surrender, humility, and servitude to a higher righteous cause. In a world obsessed with acquiring power for personal gain, Hanuman demonstrates that the greatest, most difficult display of strength is actually restraint and humility.
And then you have Lakshmana, Rama's loyal brother, who follows him into the 14-year exile. There's this incredible detail in the text about his time in the forest.
Yeah.
He doesn't sleep for 14 years.
Yes. And obviously, biologically speaking, a human being cannot stay awake for 14 years without dying. But as a literary and psychological metaphor, it is brilliant. Lakshmana's sleeplessness represents a state of constant, unyielding moral vigilance. He is the guardian archetype.
How does he contrast with Rama?
While Rama is often calm, stoic, and philosophical about their suffering, Lakshmana is a live wire. He is quick to anger, highly emotional, and fiercely ready to fight injustice the second it appears. He is the active, protective principle that balances Rama's passive acceptance.
And we have to contrast Lakshmana's vigilant action with the third brother, Bharata. When Rama is banished, the throne legally falls to Bharata. He didn't ask for it, he didn't plot to steal it, but suddenly he is handed absolute power.
And what is his psychological response to absolute power? He violently rejects it. He refuses to sit on the throne. He places Rama's sandals on the royal seat as a symbol of the true king, and he chooses to rule as a mere regent, living an ascetic life in a simple hut outside the opulent city walls.
That's incredible.
Bharata represents the ultimate psychological renunciation of unearned privilege and power. It is an incredibly difficult, rare thing for a human being to be handed absolute, unquestionable authority over a kingdom and say, no, this power is morally corrupt, and I will not let it define me.
We also can't forget Vibhishana. This is Ravana's own brother living in the enemy kingdom.
The ethical rebel. Vibhishana is caught in a profound, agonizing psychological bind. The clash between Dharma universal righteousness and loyalty to family and state. What do you do when your own brother, your own king, your own country is committing a horrific, undeniable evil?
It's the ultimate moral dilemma.
Do you stay loyal to your blood and your nation out of patriotism? Or do you defect to the invading enemy because it is the objectively moral thing to do? Vibhishana chooses universal morality over blood loyalty, and he defects to Rama. To this day, his character is a fascinating, polarizing case study in the agonizing tension between righteousness and treason.
Okay, here is where I want to do a really specific deep dive, because my absolute favorite psychological insight in the entire epic involves the character who actually starts the whole mess. Kaikeyi, Rama's stepmother. It is so incredibly easy to read her lazily as the classic wicked stepmother trope, the selfish woman who demands Rama's exile just so her own biological son can be king. But modern psychological analysis views her completely differently, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Kaike is not intrinsically evil. She is a tragic, textbook victim of severe psychological manipulation. Initially, she actually loved Rama deeply, perhaps even more than her own son. But she has a deeply bitter maidservant named Manthara, and Manthara slowly, methodically, brilliantly poisons Kaike's mind.
How did she do it?
Manthara uses techniques that modern psychologists would instantly recognize. She relies heavily on confirmation bias. She isolates Kaike and begins planting tiny, insidious seeds of doubt. She whispers, "Why did the king wait until your son was out of town to announce Rama's coronation? Why is he doing this behind your back? When Rama is king, do you really think you will be safe? Will your son be allowed to live?"
If you are listening to this, I seriously challenge you to find a more nuanced, terrifyingly accurate ancient depiction of psychological manipulation and gaslighting. Manthara plays perfectly on Kaike's deepest insecurities as a mother and an aging queen. She gaslights her into believing she is under immediate, lethal threat from a conspiracy that doesn't actually exist. Kaike doesn't demand the exile because she is a villain. She demands it because she is completely terrified. And out of manufactured panic and fear, she makes a catastrophic choice that destroys the family.
Which perfectly sets the stage for our final, most profound segment of this deep dive. Because when these intensely complex psychological archetypes, these characters driven by strict booty, manufactured fear, unchecked ego, and agonizing love collide in that unstructured liminal space of the forest, the epic's core philosophical concept is put into a crucible and subjected to extreme heat. And that concept is dharma.
Dharma. It is a word that gets thrown around constantly in modern spirituality, but it's famously difficult to translate accurately into English. We often translate it as duty or righteousness or religion, but those feel incomplete.
Because it is all of those concepts and none of them perfectly. Dharma is the cosmic law that upholds the universe, but it is also the highly specific moral duty of an individual based on their specific stage in life. To truly understand the agonizing ethical dilemmas in the Ramayana, we have to understand that ancient Indian philosophy structured human existence around four primary goals of life: dharma, artha, kama, and moksha.
Let's clearly define those four goals for the listener.
Okay, so dharma is the pursuit of moral duty, righteousness, and maintaining the social and cosmic order. Artha is the pragmatic pursuit of wealth, resources, political power, and material security. Kama is the pursuit of aesthetic pleasure, emotional love, and psychological fulfillment. And finally, moksha is the ultimate spiritual liberation from the endless cycle of death and rebirth.
So if you look at the entire epic through that framework, the Ramayana is essentially a massive, bloody laboratory testing how these four goals interact and conflict with each other in the real world, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the epic's greatest, most enduring intellectual strength is that it absolutely refuses to give simplistic, easy answers. Dharma is not a simple binary of black and white. It is incredibly messy, highly contextual, and frequently it forces a character to choose not between a clear good and a clear evil, but between two genuinely bad options. And sometimes the system of Dharma breaks under pressure in highly controversial ways.
Which brings us to the most hotly debated, agonizing ethical moment in the entire text, the crucible of Dharma. Let's look at Dilemma 1, the killing of Vali. Let's set the tactical scene for the listener. Rama, wandering in the forest, has formed a desperate political alliance with a monkey prince named Sugriva to help find the kidnapped Sita. But Sugriva has been violently exiled by his much stronger older brother, the monkey king Vali. Vali didn't just take Sugriva's kingdom, he also stole Sugriva's wife. So Rama agrees to help Sugriva defeat Vali and reclaim his throne.
Yes. To execute this plan, Sugriva goes to the capital and publicly challenges his older brother Vali to a physical duel. The two brothers begin a brutal hand-to-hand fight. They look incredibly similar and they are locked in mortal combat. Meanwhile, Rama, the greatest archer in the world, is hiding behind a thick cluster of trees. While the two brothers are grappling, Rama draws his bow, shoots a lethal arrow from his hiding spot, and strikes Vali directly in the chest, mortally wounding him.
He shoots an opponent in the back, essentially, while hiding in the bushes. It wasn't a fair face-to-face challenge by the rules of ancient warfare. So I have to ask the question that readers and scholars have been screaming for 3,000 years. Is this the dharma of an ideal righteous king? How can the perfect man, the avatar of divinity, act like a cowardly sniper in the bushes?
This specific scene reveals the absolute, unvarnished genius of Valmiki as a writer. Because he doesn't ignore the hypocrisy, he leans directly into it. As the great king Vali lays dying in the dirt, he looks into the bushes, sees Rama, and asks him exactly that question. Vali delivers a brilliant, searing, highly logical speech accusing Rama of cowardice, of breaking the warrior's code, and of destroying the very moral order he claims to protect. And Rama's defense of his actions is highly legalistic and, frankly, leaves many readers feeling deeply unsettled and unsatisfied.
What exactly is the traditional scholarly defense of Rama acting this way?
The traditional defense relies on two highly technical arguments. First, Rama argues that his supreme dharma in that exact moment was to honor his political alliance with Sugriva. He promised to ensure Sugriva won, and a king must keep his word at all costs. Second, Rama argues that by stealing his own brother's wife, Vali had forsaken human morality and was acting purely as a beast driven by lust. And the ancient legal code states that a king is permitted to hunt a wild beast in the forest from hiding. Therefore, Rama argues, he didn't assassinate a king, he legally hunted an animal.
That feels like an incredible intellectual stretch. It feels like a politician trying to justify a drone strike on a technicality.
And you are not alone in that feeling. Many ancient Indian commentators and philosophers found this scene deeply troubling and wrote massive essays trying to justify it. But looking at it academically, we both agree that the original text leaves this intentionally unresolved. The moral tension is supposed to linger and make you uncomfortable. The epic isn't saying Rama was perfectly obviously right here. It's saying, look how impossibly difficult it is to be a political leader navigating conflicting alliances. Sometimes the pragmatic demands of political artha force you to drastically compromise the pure morality of your dharma.
It is a stunning admission of moral complexity. Okay, let's look at Dilemma 2, which is perhaps even more emotionally devastating and debated today. Sita's Agni Pariksha, her trial by fire, and her subsequent banishment. We touched on the plot points earlier, but let's dig deep into the specific ethics of this moment.
After Rama fights a massive apocalyptic war to defeat Ravana and rescue his wife, they are finally reunited. But Rama refuses to accept her back immediately. Standing in front of his entire victorious army, he publicly states that because she lived as a captive in another man's house, a cloud of suspicion hangs over her sexual purity, and a king cannot sit on the throne with a tainted queen. Sita is deeply, profoundly humiliated and devastated. To conclusively prove her absolute fidelity, she orders Lakshmana to build a massive funeral pyre. She steps directly into the roaring flames. But the fire god, Agni, physically manifests, protects her from burning, and presents her back to Rama, declaring to the world that she's utterly flawless.
Now, the traditional Orthodox reading of this horrific event often tries to soften the blow and justify the hero's actions.
Right. And to be impartial, we must state how the tradition interprets it. The traditional reading argues that this was not Rama acting out of petty jealousy. Instead, traditionalists argue that Rama, knowing in his heart she was pure, intentionally orchestrated this extreme public spectacle so that Sita could claim her own agency and conclusively, definitively prove her truth to the entire world, silencing any future doubt. Furthermore, they argue Rama was sacrificing his own personal feelings of love to establish a ruthless, unquestionable standard of public integrity for the royal institution.
But the modern critical feminist critique looks at that exact same scene and sees something entirely different and deeply disturbing.
Yes. The feminist scholarly critique views this scene as a glaring, violent, patriarchal double standard. Rama's sexual purity and honor are never publicly questioned or tested, despite him being away from his wife and wandering the world for nearly a year. Sita, however, is subjected to a literal, lethal trial by fire simply because she had the misfortune of being the victim of a violent kidnapping. And the true tragedy is that even surviving the fire isn't enough. Because, as we discussed in the Uttarakhanda, mere public gossip in the capital city eventually forces Rama to abandon her anyway. The critique highlights a society where a woman's honor and very life are subjected to impossible, shifting, and lethal standards simply to protect a man's political capital.
We are not taking sides on which theological or political reading is correct, but it is absolutely vital for you listening to see how this ancient text functions as a brilliant Rorschach test for whatever society is reading it. Your values dictate how you judge the trial by fire. Now let's tackle Dilemma 3. And this one is heavily, intensely politically charged in modern India. The Shambuke episode.
This is a critical, devastating moment in the text. In the final book, the Uttarakhanda, a tragedy occurs in Rama's supposedly perfect utopian kingdom. A young Brahmin boy dies prematurely. According to the cosmic worldview, premature death means there is a severe moral imbalance or sin occurring somewhere in the kingdom. Rama goes out to search for the cause of this cosmic rot. Deep in the forest, he discovers a man named Shambuka performing incredibly intense, advanced ascetic penances, hanging upside down, starving himself to achieve immense spiritual power. Rama asks him who he is. Shambuka reveals he is a Shudra, a member of the lowest tier of the rigid caste system.
And according to the strict, dogmatic social laws of that specific later era, a Shudra was absolutely not permitted to perform such advanced spiritual asceticism.
Exactly. Rama, acting as the enforcer of cosmic law, concludes that Shambuka's violation of his caste duty is the exact sin that caused the cosmic imbalance and the Brahmin boy's death. Without hesitation, Rama draws his sword and executes Shambuka. Instantly, the gods rejoice, and the dead Brahmin boy comes back to life.
Now, obviously, reading that today, this story has been intensely, furiously criticized.
Deeply. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the brilliant principal architect of the Indian Constitution and a tireless lifelong champion for Dalit and lower caste rights, heavily criticized this specific episode. He argued it was a blatant, brutal defense of a discriminatory, violent caste system. It shows the supposedly ideal, perfect king murdering a man simply because that man was trying to better himself spiritually outside the strict confines of his birth caste.
And again, we're impartially reporting the content of the epic and the scholarly critiques of it. But here is where absolutely everything we discussed earlier in this deep dive comes full circle. This is where the dry textual history we talked about crashes violently into the modern ethical debate in the most spectacular, profound way possible. Because what did the 50-year academic excavation of the Baroda Critical Edition teach us about the Uttarakhanda?
This is the sheer world-altering brilliance of modern textual analysis. Thanks to those scholars sitting in rooms for 50 years, comparing crumbling palm leaves line by line, we now know, with a very high degree of academic certainty, that the entire Shambuka episode is a later interpolation. It is found exclusively in the Uttarakacha, which was added centuries after the original core text.
Meaning, the story of the ideal king murdering a lower caste man for praying was practically guaranteed not to be in Valmiki's original vision of the hero.
Exactly. When you use textual forensics to strip away the Gothic spires and the stained glass windows added centuries later, you find that the core foundation of the Ramayana does not contain this brutal defense of rigid caste violence. The Shambuka story was almost certainly invented and inserted by much later authors who wanted to use the immense, unassailable cultural authority of Rama to enforce the rigid social and caste hierarchies of their specific era.
I want you listening to really truly grasp the magnitude of that. Modern textual analysis literally rescues the core moral integrity of the epic from later political and social manipulations. It proves that a story historically used as a weapon to enforce inequality was actually a forged edition. It was a corruption of the original poet's empathetic vision. It changes absolutely everything about how we view the history of the culture.
It truly does. It proves that analyzing an ancient text academically isn't just an exercise in memorizing dusty dates or debating grammar rules. It has profound, real-world implications for social justice, for uncovering historical truth, and for how an entire modern civilization understands its own spiritual and moral heritage.
Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground in this deep dive today. Let's recap the journey we've been on. We started by looking up at the celestial stars, intensely debating whether planetary alignments generated by modern software from 5114 BCE or the strict grammatical rules of Panini from 400 BCE hold the true key to unlocking the epic's timeline. We stood on the banks of the Tamasa River and watched a grieving, traumatized poet invent the 32-syllable mathematical meter that would define Asian literature for millennia.
We journeyed into the dusty archives of Vadodara, tracing a grueling 50-year manuscript hunt that revealed the epic was a living, breathing, evolving cathedral. We learned how scholars stripped away the first and last books to find Valmiki's authentic core. We dove deep into the complex psychology of ancient archetypes, understanding Rama's tragic, dehumanizing burden of identity, Sita's unyielding, brilliant agency in a rigged system, and Ravana's terrifying, self-destructive, unchecked ego.
And finally, we stepped into the agonizing ethical crucible of Dharma. We watched the ideal man make a highly questionable kill from the shadows. We watched a queen walk into the flames to satisfy a suspicious public, and we saw how modern academic scholarship can actually peel back the corrupted layers of history to reveal the true, untainted moral core of a civilization.
And the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, the reason you should carry this knowledge forward is this. The Ramayana's immortality does not come from being a flawless, static rulebook of perfect behavior. Its immense power comes from being a mirror. The profound tensions its characters feel between political duty and personal love, between maintaining dignity in the face of humiliation, between possessing profound knowledge and falling victim to blinding arrogance, are the exact same tensions you and I feel today. It is a story about the agonizing, beautiful difficulty of simply being human and trying to figure out what the right thing to do is in a deeply complex, unfair world.
Beautifully said. And I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought, something for you to chew on that builds on everything we've learned today. We discovered that the Ramayana is fundamentally a living text. It grew, it mutated, and it accumulated new stories and philosophies, like the massive editions of the first and seventh books, over hundreds of years as society changed and demanded new answers. It adapted to fit the needs of the people reading it. Which makes me wonder, what does the modern interpolation look like? When we watch a brand new television adaptation or read a modern comic book retelling, or even when we sit here today having an academic discussion analyzing its feminism and psychological archetypes, are we just passively consuming old media? Or are we, by reinterpreting it for our current era, actually witnessing and actively participating in the real-time writing of the eighth Kanda?